Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are secrets within the Imperium of man that stretch back further than recorded memory. Secrets that existed before the Emperor walked among the stars, before the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, before the Great Crusade unified a million worlds under one golden banner. These are old secrets, quiet secrets, the kind that linger in the spaces between breath and silence, between one heartbeat and the next, patient and watchful and utterly, profoundly unknowable. And at the heart of one of these ancient secrets, dwelling in the lowest depths of a shattered world turned mobile fortress, moving through corridors that no human hand has ever mapped, there exists a species of being so strange, so alien in its nature and purpose, that even the superhuman warriors who live alongside them cannot say with any certainty what they truly are. They are small, barely reaching the waist of an armored space marine. They wear robes of deep monastic green or grey, their faces lost in the shadow of heavy cowls. They carry no weapons, they speak no words, they do not eat, they do not sleep, at least not in any way that has ever been observed. They simply appear, standing in the half-light of ancient corridors, watching with whatever passes for eyes beneath those hoods, and then they vanish again, as though they had never existed at all. They are the Watchers in the dark, and they are, without question, the most mysterious beings in all of Warhammer 40,000. At now, that is a bold claim. This is a setting overflowing with mysteries, a galaxy drowning in unanswered questions and half-remembered truths. You have the Emperor himself, that ageless figure on the golden throne whose true intentions remain debated after 10,000 years of worship. You have the Satan, those star-eating gods of living metal whose motives twist and turn with the patience of beings who measured their lives in eons before humanity even crawled out of the primordial mud. You have the Harlequins, those dancing warrior players of the Eldari who serve a god of deception and trickery, and who move through the webway with the grace of actors performing a play whose script was written at the dawn of creation. All of these are fascinating. All of them hold their own kind of unknowable grandeur, but the Watchers in the dark occupy a different category entirely, because the thing that makes them so uniquely enigmatic is not simply that we do not understand them. It is that the people who live with them, who walk beside them every single day, who have shared the same corridors and chambers and battlefields for 10,000 years, do not understand them either. The Dark Angels, the First Legion, the Sons of the Lion, one of the most ancient and secretive Space Marine chapters in the entire Imperium, have never been able to determine what these beings are, where they come from, what they want, or why they choose to remain. And that silence, that absolute refusal to reveal themselves even to those they ostensibly serve, is what makes the Watchers so compelling. They are a mystery wrapped in another mystery, hidden inside a fortress that is itself built from the broken remnants of a planet that was deliberately destroyed to conceal yet more secrets. They are the nesting doll of Warhammer 40K enigmas, and tonight we are going to go as deep into that labyrinth as the lore will allow us. So settle in, find somewhere comfortable. Let the sounds of the world around you fade into the background, and let us descend together into the depths of the rock, into corridors lit by flickering lumen globes and the faint hum of ancient machinery, where the air tastes of recycled oxygen and incense smoke, and something older, something that has no name. Let us walk among the Watchers and see what truths we can peel from the darkness that surrounds them. To understand the Watchers in the dark, and to really grasp why they matter and what they might represent, we first need to go back, way back. Not to the founding of the Dark Angels chapter, or even to the creation of the First Legion during the Unification Wars. We need to go all the way back to a world that no longer exists, a planet that was torn apart by treachery and sorcery and the rage of demigods, leaving behind only a single asteroid-sized fragment that now drifts through the void as the Dark Angels' mobile fortress monastery. Well, we need to go back to Caliban. Caliban was, by any standard, one of the most dangerous worlds that humanity ever colonized. Classified by imperial astrocartographers as a death world, it was a planet where survival was not a given, but a daily negotiation with forces that wanted you dead. The surface was covered almost entirely in vast primordial forests, dense and ancient, and twisted in ways that went beyond mere biological growth. These were not the ordered woodlands of a civilized world, up-trimmed and maintained by careful human stewardship. These were forests that felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with photosynthesis and everything to do with something far darker, far more primal. The trees grew enormous, their canopies so thick that in some regions sunlight never reached the ground. Mist clung to the forest floor like a living thing, curling around the roots of trees whose bark was dark as iron and rough as stone. The air was heavy, perpetually damp, and carrying sense of decay and growth intermingled in a cycle that seemed to have no beginning and no end. And in the deepest parts of those forests, where even the bravest knights of Caliban's feudal kingdoms hesitated to tread, there was a wrongness that could be felt in the bones. A presence, a pressure on the mind, like being watched by something that had no eyes. This was not mere superstition or the overactive imagination of primitive people. Caliban sat in close proximity to the Eye of Terror, that vast wound in reality torn open by the fall of the Eye Eldari, and the warp energies that bled from that rift had been seeping into the planet for millennia. The forests were saturated with this corruption, and it manifested in the most terrible way imaginable, in the great beasts. The great beasts of Caliban were creatures born from the intersection of natural biology and warp-spawned mutation. Each one was unique, as a singular horror that defied easy classification. Some were vast, armored predators the size of battle tanks, with hides that could turn aside bolt rounds and claws that could tear through plasteel. Others were more subtle in their horror, shapeshifters and shadow stalkers that could blend into the forest itself, becoming indistinguishable from the trees until they struck with a speed that left their prey dead before the pain even registered. The most feared of all were the Calibanite lions, massive creatures of terrifying speed and near impervious natural armor, whose mere presence seemed to darken the air around them. Humanity survived on Caliban not through dominance, but through endurance and the grim determination of a warrior aristocracy that had evolved to meet the planet's horrific challenges. The people lived in fortress settlements, great stone citadels built in clearings, hacked from the forest with fire and axe and the blood of generations. The nobility organized themselves into knightly orders, brotherhoods of warriors whose entire purpose was to venture into the forests, face the great beasts, and keep the human enclaves safe from the horrors that prowled beyond the tree line. These fortresses were monuments to humanity's refusal to surrender, built from stone quarried at the cost of lives. Their walls thick enough to resist the battering of the largest beasts, and tall enough to provide the sentries atop them with a view of the tree line, that ever-present boundary where civilization ended and nightmare began. Inside these walls, life continued with a grim normalcy. Children were born and raised knowing that the forests were death. Craftsmen plied their trades. Farmers worked the cleared land between the fortress walls and the forest edge, always looking over their shoulders, as always ready to drop their tools and run for the gates at the first sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. The knightly orders themselves were something between medieval chivalric brotherhoods and specialized monster hunting guilds. Each order had its own traditions, its own rites of initiation, its own preferred methods of hunting and killing the great beasts. Some favored the lance and the charge, meeting the monsters head-on with courage that bordered on suicidal recklessness. Others preferred traps and ambushes, luring beasts into prepared kill zones where crossbow bolts and crude explosive charges could bring them down. All of them understood, on a level that went beyond mere knowledge into something closer to instinct, that the forests were not simply dangerous, but actively malevolent. Asked that the darkness between the trees was not empty, but full of something that watched and waited and hated. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how unusual Caliban's situation was in the broader context of the galaxy. Death worlds were not uncommon in the Imperium. Catahan, Fenris, Nocturne, dozens of planets presented environments hostile enough to kill the unwary in moments. But Caliban was different, because its danger was not merely environmental. Yet the beasts that haunted its forests were not natural predators that had evolved in response to ecological pressures. They were warped things, corrupted by energies that had no business existing in the material universe, and their presence spoke to something fundamentally wrong about the planet itself. Something buried deep, something old. The common folk of Caliban had stories about this wrongness. They called it the taint, or the blight, or simply the darkness. And they attributed it to various supernatural causes, depending on which region of the planet they inhabited and which knightly order protected them. Some believed that an ancient curse had been laid upon the world by a sorcerer from the distant past. Others held that the forests themselves were alive, that the trees were vessels for spirits of malice and hunger that could never be satisfied. A few, as the ones who lived closest to the Northworlds and who had the most frequent encounters with the great beasts, whispered about things that lived beneath the earth, things that were older than the trees, older than the mountains, older perhaps than life itself. They were closer to the truth than they could have possibly known. And it was in this context of perpetual siege, of humanity living in fortified islands, surrounded by an ocean of warp-corrupted wilderness, that the legends of the Watchers in the Dark took their firmest hold in the culture, because the people of Caliban knew, even if they could not articulate it in scientific terms, that their forests harbored more than just beasts. There were things in those woods that did not fit any category of creature they understood. Things that were neither predator nor prey, neither threatening nor helpful, but simply present, us observing from the periphery of human experience with an attention that felt ancient and unknowable. The greatest of these orders was simply called the Order, a brotherhood that would eventually be led by a figure of legend, a being who had been found as a wild child in the deepest reaches of the forest, who had grown to possess strength and intelligence beyond anything human, who had single-handedly hunted and killed more great beasts than any knight in Caliban's long and bloody history. His name was Lion L. Johnson, and he was, though he did not yet know it, one of the Emperor's lost Primarchs, a demigod general created to lead one of the 20 Space Marine legions. But the Lion's story, magnificent and tragic as it is a tale for another time. What matters for our purposes tonight is what else lived in those forests, because the great beasts were not the only things lurking in the shadows beneath Caliban's ancient canopy. There was something else out there, something that the people of Caliban had known about for as long as anyone could remember, a presence that existed at the very edge of perception, at the boundary between folktale and reality. The people of Caliban called them the Watchers in the Dark. In the ancient legends of the planet, the Watchers were described as mysterious figures who wandered the darkest regions of the wild hinterlands, as the deepest and most forbidding parts of the forest, where even the great beasts seemed reluctant to go. They were small, these figures, barely reaching the hip of a grown man, and they wore robes or cloaks that concealed their forms entirely. No one who claimed to have seen them could ever describe what they actually looked like beneath those coverings. Some said they had the proportions of children, others that their bodies were shaped in ways that were subtly but deeply wrong, as though whatever lay beneath the cloth had never been designed to look human in the first place. The Watchers never spoke, they never attacked, they never interacted with the human settlements in any direct or obvious way. They simply appeared at the edges of vision, standing among the trees in the half-light of dawn or dusk, watching, and then they were gone. Some of the knightly orders considered them to be forest spirits, as remnants of some older time when Caliban had been home to gentler things. Others believed them to be omens, harbingers of danger or change whose appearance presaged great upheaval. A few, the more superstitious among the common folk, believed them to be the ghosts of dead knights, forever bound to the forests they had fought and died to protect. None of these explanations were correct, but none of them were entirely wrong either. The first real encounter between the Watchers in the Dark and a named figure in the established lore occurs in the Horus Heresy novel Descent of Angels by Mitchell Scanlon, and it is one of the most quietly unsettling scenes in the entire series. The encounter centers on a young knight of the Order named Zahariel, a boy barely into his teens, who would later go on to become a librarian of the Dark Angels Legion, and, eventually, one of the most tragically compromised figures in the entire Dark Angels saga. But at this point in his story, Zahariel was simply a young knight supplicant, burning with ambition and grief. His mentor within the Order, a knight named Amadis, had been killed by a great beast, a creature referred to as the Beast of Endriago. Driven by a combination of honor, sorrow, and the need to prove himself worthy of the brotherhood he aspired to join, Zahariel declared a beast quest, in a tradition among the knightly orders of Caliban, in which a single knight would venture alone into the wilderness to hunt and slay one of the great beasts. It was a rite of passage, a test of courage and skill that separated the merely brave from the truly exceptional. Many who undertook beast quests never returned. Zahariel traveled north into the North Wilds, a region of Caliban that was considered particularly dangerous even by the brutal standards of a death world. The forests here were different from those closer to human settlement. They were older, denser, and the wrongness that permeated all of Caliban's wilderness was concentrated here into something almost palpable. The trees grew in twisted, tortured shapes, their bark covered in growths that looked disturbingly organic, almost like tumors. The ground underfoot was soft and spongy, as though the earth itself was diseased. And the deeper Zahariel went into this blighted woodland, the stronger the sense of being watched became. It was in a clearing, or perhaps a space that had been made to appear like a clearing, that Zahariel first saw them. Small figures, robed and hooded, standing at the edge of the trees in absolute stillness. There was no sound from them, no rustling of cloth, no whisper of breath. They simply existed there, impossible to ignore, yet impossible to fully perceive, as though the eye kept trying to slide off them and focus on something else. And then, and against everything the legends had ever said about them, the Watchers communicated with Zahariel. The exact mechanism of this communication is left deliberately ambiguous in the text. It was not speech, as humans understand it. There was no sound, no movement of lips beneath those hoods. Instead, Zahariel simply became aware of meaning, of intent, of warnings that seemed to form directly in his mind without passing through his ears. This was almost certainly a form of psychic communication, which is significant for reasons we will discuss later. But what mattered most was not how the Watchers spoke, but what they said. They warned him. They told him that the forests of the North Wilds were corrupted, that the taint that had spawned the great beasts was merely a symptom of a far greater evil, an evil that they described as the bane of all humanity. They spoke of this evil not as something new or temporary, but as something ancient and eternal, and a force that could never truly be defeated, but could only be held at bay, fought and resisted and contained through endless vigilance. So long as there were thinking beings in the galaxy, this evil would exist. They were, of course, describing chaos, the ruinous powers, the primordial annihilator, the great enemy that lurked in the Imperium, that fed on the emotions and fears and desires of every sentient creature in the galaxy. Well, that could never be destroyed because its existence was inseparable from the existence of consciousness itself. But here is what makes this encounter so remarkable, so deeply important to understanding what the Watchers truly are. This conversation took place before the Horus Heresy, before the betrayal, before the galaxy was torn apart by civil war and the Emperor was entombed on the Golden Throne. At this point in the timeline, the Imperium of Man was at the height of its power. The Great Crusade was sweeping across the galaxy with unstoppable momentum, and the existence of chaos was a secret known only to the Emperor and a handful of his most trusted advisors. The average Imperial citizen, the average space marine even, had no idea that the warp was home to malevolent intelligences that sought the destruction of all rational life. And yet here were these small, robed beings, standing in a forest on a backwater feudal world, demonstrating a knowledge of chaos that was deeper and more nuanced than anything possessed by the Imperium's greatest scholars. They knew what chaos was. They knew it could not be defeated. And they had apparently been fighting against it, in their own quiet way, for longer than anyone could measure. Zahariel, moved by their warning and sensing the truth in their words, made an oath. He swore that he would do everything in his power to oppose the same evil that the Watchers stood against. And the Watchers, sensing something in the young knight's resolve, accepted his vow. They had tested him, debated among themselves whether this human could be trusted, whether he might be useful in their endless struggle, and they had decided that he was worthy of their confidence. Then they disappeared. They did not walk away. They did not fade gradually. They were simply gone, as though they had never been there at all. Leaving Zahariel alone in the corrupted forest, with nothing but his oath and the lingering sense that he had just encountered something far more significant than he could possibly understand. Zahariel continued his quest. He found the beast of Endriago, which turned out to be a Calibanite lion, one of the most feared creatures on the entire planet. During the battle, Zahariel's latent psychic abilities manifested for the first time, allowing him to perceive time differently, and to see openings in the creature's defenses that would have been invisible to normal perception. He killed the beast, an extraordinary feat for a boy his age, and returned to the Order as a hero. But the encounter with the Watchers had planted something in Zahariel's mind, a seed of awareness that would grow and twist over the decades that followed, eventually entangling itself with darker influences that would lead to his downfall. The Watchers had chosen him, had invested something in him. It had seen potential in this young knight that they believed could serve their cause. They would be proven wrong, but their attempt tells us something crucial about their nature and their methods. They did not operate through force or coercion. They operated through influence, through subtle manipulation, through the careful selection of individuals who might be guided towards serving a greater purpose. This is not the behavior of simple creatures. This is not the method of beasts or constructs or mindless servants. This is the strategy of intelligences that think in terms of centuries and millennia, that plant seeds in one age and wait patiently for them to bear fruit in another. And it is the first clear indication that the Watchers in the Dark are something far, far more than anyone on Caliban ever suspected. So what are they? What are the Watchers in the Dark, really? As this is the question that has haunted fans and scholars of the Warhammer 40,000 lore for decades. And it is a question that Games Workshop has deliberately, masterfully refused to answer in full. But the Horus Heresy novels, particularly the Dark Angels-focused books by authors like Mitchell Scanlon and Gav Thorpe, have pulled back the curtain just enough to give us a picture that is as fascinating as it is incomplete. The first and most important thing we know about the Watchers is what they are not. They are not creatures of the warp. This is crucial, because in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the vast majority of supernatural or paranormal phenomena can be traced back to the Imperium in one way or another. Demons, psychic powers, warp storms, possession, the corrupting influence of chaos, all of these are manifestations of the same fundamental force, the roiling, an emotion-driven parallel dimension that underlies all of physical reality. When you encounter something strange and inexplicable in the 41st millennium, the default assumption is usually that the warp is involved somehow. But the Watchers do not fit this model. They are not warp-based entities. They do not register on the psychic spectrum the way demons or warp-spawned creatures do. They cannot be banished by the methods used to dismiss demonic entities. And they do not appear to be affected by the fluctuations and storms of the Imperium that wreak havoc on so much else. In fact, one of their most distinctive characteristics is their resistance to the warp. They possess a near-exclusive ability to resist warp entities and influences, a trait that is described in the lore as being comparable to the abilities of pariahs. Those extraordinarily rare humans born without a presence in the warp, who can nullify psychic phenomena simply by existing in close proximity to them. But the Watchers are not pariahs either. Pariahs nullify the warp around them completely, creating a dead zone of psychic energy that is deeply uncomfortable for normal humans and absolutely agonizing for psychers. The Watchers do not appear to have this effect. They can communicate psychically, as we saw in Zahariel's encounter. And their presence does not cause the kind of psychic disruption that a true pariah would generate. Their resistance to the warp is something different, something that operates through a mechanism that has never been fully explained. What the lore does tell us is that the Watchers are extra-dimensional beings. This is a term that gets used carefully and deliberately in the Horus Heresy novels, and it carries a very specific meaning. The Watchers do not originate from the Imperium. They're the physical universe that we and every other conventional species inhabit. They do not originate from the Imperium, the warp, the realm of chaos and emotion and psychic energy. They come from somewhere else entirely, a third dimension of existence that is neither physical nor psychic, a realm that is never named or described in any detail, but that clearly operates under fundamentally different rules than either of the two dimensions we are familiar with. Thus, this is what makes the Watchers truly extraordinary. In the cosmology of Warhammer 40,000, almost everything can be categorized as belonging to either the material universe or the warp. Stars, planets, people, aliens, all physical things exist in the Imperium. Demons, psychic phenomena, the chaos gods themselves, all of these exist in the Imperium. The two dimensions overlap and interact in complex ways, but between them, they account for essentially the totality of known existence. As the Watchers break this binary completely, they represent evidence that the Warhammer 40,000 universe contains dimensions beyond the two that we know about. Higher planes of existence that are accessible only to beings who were never part of the material or psychic realms to begin with. And the implications of this are staggering, because it means that the Watchers possess knowledge and capabilities that are literally beyond the framework that everything else in the setting operates within. Whereas the Horus Heresy novels describe their perception in terms that are almost impossible to fully comprehend. For the Watchers, concepts like time and space appear to be irrelevant in the way we understand them. They are described as being able to view time as a three-dimensional mosaic, a vast, multi-layered structure that they can examine and study the way a human might study a painting or a sculpture. They can zoom in on particular details, identify specific moments of significance, and determine how those moments might be influenced to produce different outcomes. They cannot comprehend the totality of this temporal structure. It is too vast and too complex even for them. But they can perceive enough of it to make informed judgments about the flow of events and the likely consequences of particular actions. This ability to perceive time as a spatial phenomenon rather than a linear progression is something that no other entity in Warhammer 40,000, now with the possible exception of the Emperor himself and perhaps the most powerful of the Chaos gods, has ever been described as possessing. Even the Eldari Farseers, those master seers of a psychically gifted race, perceive the future as probability, as branching paths of potential outcomes that become less certain the further ahead they look. The Watchers do not see probability. They see time itself, laid out before them like a landscape that can be traversed and examined at leisure. And they can also appear and disappear at will, materializing in one location and vanishing from it without any apparent transition, as though the physical rules governing movement through space simply do not apply to them. They cannot be captured or ambushed. They cannot be tracked or followed. They arrive where they wish to be, observe what they wish to observe, and depart when they are finished, and there is nothing that any force in the galaxy can do to prevent this. Well, this is not teleportation as the Imperium understands it, which involves the physical translation of matter from one point to another, through either technological or psychic means. This is something far more fundamental, a basic property of beings for whom spatial location is a choice rather than a constraint. Their physical form, the small, robed figure that everyone is familiar with, appears to be something they adopt rather than something they inherently possess. Yet the lore describes them as taking their diminutive appearance out of habit when they enter corporeal reality. which strongly implies that their true form is something entirely different, something that exists in their native dimension and that cannot be directly perceived or comprehended by beings bound to the material universe. The robes, the small stature, the hooded silhouette. All of this is essentially a costume, in a way of presenting themselves in a form that can be perceived by physical beings without causing confusion or distress. What actually lies beneath those robes? No one knows. Not the dark angels who have lived alongside the Watchers for 10,000 years. Not the tech priests who have presumably attempted at some point to scan or analyze them. Not even the law itself gives a definitive answer. And that deliberate ambiguity, that careful maintenance of mystery, is one of the most effective pieces of world building in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. But their alien nature raises an equally important question. If they are not from this universe, and they are not from the warp, then why are they here? What brought beings from a higher dimension to a single, relatively insignificant planet on the northern fringe of the Eye of Terror? The answer, as best as the lore can provide it, lies in a connection that links the Watchers to one of the most secretive and far-reaching organizations in the entire Warhammer 40,000 timeline, the Cabal. Now, the Cabal deserves a careful and thorough examination here, because understanding who they were and what they wanted is essential to grasping the Watchers' place in the larger web of galactic politics and supernatural warfare that defines the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The Cabal was a secret organization composed of representatives from more than 1,000 different alien species, all united by a single purpose: the eradication, or at the very least, the containment, of chaos. The Cabal claimed to have been fighting against the primordial annihilator for a period of time longer than humanity had existed as a thinking species. Their membership included beings of almost inconceivable diversity: insectoid creatures, energy-based life forms, mechanical intelligences, avian and reptilian species, and even members of the Aeldari race, all working together in defiance of the xenophobia and isolationism that characterized most interspecies relations in the galaxy. At the heart of the Cabal's inner circle was an entity known as Gahet, a member of a species that the Aeldari called the Old Kind, a designation that suggested origins stretching back to the earliest epochs of galactic history, while some have speculated that Gahet might have been one of the Slan, those amphibian servants of the Old Ones who were among the first intelligent species created during the War in Heaven. If true, this would place the Cabal's leadership in the same epical category as the Watchers themselves, beings whose involvement in galactic affairs predated not just the Imperium of Man, but the fall of the Aeldari, the rise and decline of the Necrontire, and perhaps even the War in Heaven itself. The Cabal's methods were indirect. They operated through manipulation and the careful steering of events rather than direct confrontation, using their collective ability to perceive probable futures through a mechanism called the acuity. This allowed them to identify pivotal moments in galactic history and attempt to influence them toward outcomes that would weaken or diminish the power of the ruinous powers. They were, in essence, playing an incredibly long game, a chess match against chaos itself that had been in progress for millions of years. The Cabal is best known in the lore for their involvement with the Alpha Legion and the twin Primarchs, Alfarius and Omegon, whom they attempted to convince that the only way to permanently destroy chaos was to ensure that Horus won the heresy. The logic behind this plan, if you can call it logic, was that a victorious Horus would eventually be consumed by guilt over killing the Emperor, and this guilt would drive him to wage a war of self-destruction against his own followers. The resulting conflict would consume humanity entirely, and because the Chaos Gods were supposedly dependent on human emotion for their sustenance, the death of humanity would mean the death of chaos. Non-human species would survive, and could then rebuild the galaxy free from the influence of the ruinous powers. This plan was, to put it as charitably as possible, deeply problematic. yet it required the extinction of an entire species on the basis of predictions made by beings who, however powerful, had already demonstrated that their ability to foresee the future was far from infallible. It also rested on the demonstrably false assumption that chaos was exclusively dependent on human emotion, ignoring the countless examples of non-human species that had fallen to corruption throughout galactic history. The Aeldari had literally birthed a chaos god through their collective psychic excess. The notion that eliminating humanity would starve the other three gods into non-existence was, at best, wishful thinking. The Cabal was eventually destroyed by the Aeldari Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, who concluded that the organization's members were doing more harm than good with their grand manipulations. Eldrad recruited a former word-bearer named Barthusa Narek and systematically eliminated the Cabal's leadership, killing Gahet, the Aeldari Autarch Slaudar, and several other key members. By the 32nd millennium, the Cabal no longer existed as a functional organization, its grand plan for the defeat of chaos having failed utterly, and its members either dead or scattered. But here is what connects the Cabal to our story. The Watchers in the Dark are implied to have been members of, or at least closely associated with, the Cabal. They shared the Cabal's fundamental goal of opposing chaos, and they were aware of the Cabal's activities and plans. However, and this is a critical distinction, the Watchers did not share the Cabal's belief that chaos could be permanently defeated. Where the Cabal believed that the right combination of events could destroy the ruinous powers once and for all, the Watchers held a different view entirely. They believed that chaos could not be defeated. It could only be fought. This philosophical difference is enormously significant because it completely changes the nature of the Watchers' engagement with galactic events. The Cabal was playing a grand game, attempting to engineer a specific outcome, the permanent destruction of chaos, through the manipulation of galactic-scale events like the Horus Heresy. The Watchers were not interested in this grand game. They were not trying to win a final victory. They were committed to an eternal struggle, a war without end against an enemy that could never be truly vanquished, and their actions were oriented not toward achieving a decisive victory, but toward maintaining the containment and resistance of chaos in whatever forms and circumstances they found themselves. This is why the Watchers were sent to Caliban, not to win a war, but to guard a prison. And the prisoner they were set to watch over was something called the Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is one of the most important and least understood artifacts in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, and its connection to the Watchers in the Dark is absolutely central to understanding their role in galactic history. According to the lore, the Ouroboros is a sentient warp device that was found on Caliban during the Horus Heresy, and it has been described in various sources as a warp creature resembling a vast worm with enormous pincers and a disturbingly human face, though this physical description may be merely one aspect of a far more complex entity. What is clear is that the Ouroboros is not simply a beast or a natural phenomenon. It is described as a sister device to two other entities, the Tushulcha engine, a sentient warp engine that aligned itself with the Dark Angels during the Great Crusade, and the Plague Heart, a nightmarish construct held for a time by the Death Guard warlord Typhus. Together, these three devices form something called the Key, an artifact of almost incomprehensible power that was originally created by the Old Ones, that ancient race of Psykers who fought the war in heaven against the Necron-Tyre and their Satan masters millions of years before humanity even existed. The Key was designed to create and expand the webway. It's that vast network of extra-dimensional tunnels that the Old Ones used to traverse the galaxy without having to enter the dangerous currents of the warp. In essence, the Key was a tunneling device capable of boring new pathways through the fabric of reality itself, connecting distant points of the galaxy through shortcuts that bypassed both normal space and the Imperium. And the Ouroboros was 1/3 of this Key. 1/3 of a device built by beings who predated every living civilization in the galaxy. 1/3 of a weapon that could, in theory, be used to unlock a vault somewhere within the webway that contained weapons from the war in heaven, artifacts of godlike power that had been sealed away for reasons that were presumably very, very good.
Now, before we keep going, I just want to say something real quick. Out of everything I've covered on this channel, the Watchers might generally be my favorite piece of the lore in the entire setting. And I think the reason is that Games Workshop has actually shown restraint with them. They haven't over-explained it, they haven't ruined it with some big reveal. Every time I go back to research these guys, I find another little thread I missed, another connection that makes the whole thing deeper. And honestly, reading through all the Dark Angels Horus Heresy novels for this reminded me why I got into 40k in the first place. It's that feeling of pulling on a thread and realizing the sweater goes on forever. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
The Watchers in the Dark were its jailers. According to the Ouroboros itself, at some point in the distant past, the Watchers had been given, or had taken upon themselves, the responsibility of guarding this device, of keeping it contained, of preventing anyone from accessing its power or using it for purposes that could destabilize the already precarious balance between the material universe and the Imperium. The Watchers had been on Caliban for this purpose long before humanity ever arrived on the planet. They had been there for millennia, perhaps tens of millennia, standing silent vigil over an artifact that most of the galaxy did not even know existed. This changes everything about how we understand the Watchers' presence on Caliban. They were not forest spirits, or nature guardians, or the ghosts of dead knights. They were sentinels, placed on a specific world for a specific purpose by forces operating at a level of power and knowledge that makes even the Imperium of man look like a collection of children playing with tools they do not understand. God, the great beasts that terrorized Caliban's human population were, from the Watchers' perspective, merely a side effect, a symptom of the warp contamination that leaked from the Ouroboros and from Caliban's proximity to the Eye of Terror. The real danger, the thing that the Watchers were truly concerned about, was buried deep beneath the planet's surface, coiled in the dark like a serpent waiting to strike. And this guardianship was not merely passive. The Watchers actively worked to prevent the Ouroboros from being freed or its power from being accessed. When the librarian Zahariel, corrupted by his exposure to the Ouroboros during the Horus Heresy, began to believe that the device was actually the soul of Caliban itself, and attempted to draw on its power, the Watchers opposed him. They had tried to guide Zahariel, to steer him away from the Ouroboros and toward the genuine world spirit of Caliban. All but the young librarian rejected their guidance. The Ouroboros was too seductive, its promises of power too tempting, and Zahariel fell under its influence, becoming one of the first of the so-called fallen angels. The Watchers' failure with Zahariel is one of the most poignant moments in their entire history. They had invested in him, had chosen him as a potential champion in their war against the corruption that plagued Caliban, and he had rejected them in favor of the very thing they were trying to contain. It speaks to the limitations of even these extraordinary beings, the reality that their ability to perceive time and influence events does not make them omnipotent or infallible. They can guide, they can warn, they can place the right person in the right place at the right time, but they cannot force anyone to make the right choice. Free will remains beyond their power to override us, and that vulnerability has cost them dearly more than once. But there is another dimension to the Ouroboros story that connects directly to one of the most recent and dramatic developments in Warhammer 40,000 lore. In the novel The Lion, Son of the Forest by Mike Brooks, and in the Arcs of Omen campaign books, it was revealed that Caliban itself was not a natural planet. It was an artifact of the Old Ones, a construct designed to build and expand the webway. As the planet that the Dark Angels had called home, the world whose destruction haunted them for 10,000 years, was itself a piece of ancient technology, a remnant of the war in heaven, repurposed and forgotten, and eventually colonized by humans who had no idea what they were living on. This revelation puts the Watchers' long guardianship in a completely new light. They were not simply guarding the Ouroboros. They were guarding an entire planetary construct of Old One's origin, and a device whose potential applications were so powerful and so dangerous that it needed to be watched over by beings from beyond the known dimensions of reality. The stakes of their vigil were not merely preventing one artifact from falling into the wrong hands. They were protecting the galaxy from the consequences of an entire world weapon being activated or subverted. And when the forces of chaos, specifically the demon-smith Vashtor the Archiphane, as eventually succeeded in collecting the 3 pieces of the key and reassembling a twisted version of Caliban as the demon world Wormwood, the consequences were exactly as catastrophic as the Watchers would have feared. The key was activated, the webway was breached, and Abaddon the Despoiler, Warmaster of Chaos, gained access to a tool that could potentially allow him to reach sealed vaults containing weapons from the war in heaven itself. The Watchers' worst nightmare, yet the thing they had been guarding against for eons uncounted, had come to pass. And yet they endured. They continued to serve. They continued to watch. Because for beings who believe that chaos cannot be defeated but only fought, failure is not an end. It is merely a new chapter in an eternal war. The Horus Heresy was the defining catastrophe of human history in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a galaxy-spanning civil war that shattered the Imperium of man, crippled the Emperor, and set the stage for 10,000 years of darkness, decay, and endless conflict. Every Space Marine Legion was affected. Every Primarch was changed, destroyed, or lost. And for the Dark Angels, the First Legion, the heresy brought a specific and uniquely devastating form of tragedy: the fall of Caliban and the creation of the Fallen. The story of how the Dark Angels were divided is long and complex, tangled with personal rivalries, political machinations, and the insidious influence of chaos working through human weakness and ambition. At its core, it is the story of 2 men: Lion L. Johnson, the Primarch, brilliant and secretive and utterly devoted to the Emperor, and Luther, his adoptive father and closest friend, the man who had found the infant Primarch in the forests of Caliban and raised him to become the greatest warrior the planet had ever known. Ed Luther had been left behind on Caliban when the Lion departed with the bulk of the Legion to fight in the Great Crusade. It was meant to be an honor, the stewardship of their homeworld, the oversight of recruitment and training for the next generation of Dark Angels. But Luther, too old to become a true Astartes, and thus denied the full transformation that his younger brothers had undergone, felt the appointment as an exile, a punishment, in a way for the Lion to keep him out of sight, while the Primarch accrued glory and renown on the battlefields of the galaxy. Jealousy is a small seed, but given enough darkness and enough time, it can grow into something monstrous. And on Caliban, darkness was never in short supply. Luther began to study the forbidden law that had been seized from the destroyed Knights of Lupus, as a Calibanite knightly order that had been corrupted by the warp and that had sought to preserve the great beasts rather than destroy them. This law opened doors in Luther's mind that should have remained sealed, and through those doors, the whispers of chaos began to enter. It is worth pausing to consider the specific nature of Caliban's corruption during this period, because it directly relates to the Watcher's role and concerns. Of the warp taint that had always permeated the planet was not merely an ambient background condition. It had a source, a focal point, and that source was the Ouroboros, the Old One's artifact buried deep beneath the planet's crust. As the Great Crusade brought enormous changes to Caliban, as the forests were clear-cut and the ancient ecosystems destroyed to make way for imperial manufactoria and recruitment centers, the delicate balance that the Watchers had maintained for millennia was disrupted. The great beasts, which had served as a kind of living buffer between the civilized areas and the deepest concentrations of warp taint, were hunted to extinction. The knightly orders that had provided a human element in the fight against corruption were disbanded and absorbed into the Legion. Without the beasts to absorb and channel the warp energy, without the forests to act as a natural barrier, Yet the corruption that had always been present in Caliban's soil and water began to concentrate and intensify. The Ouroboros stirred, and the humans living on the planet, already stressed and unsettled by the massive social upheaval that the Imperium's arrival had caused, became increasingly susceptible to its influence. Meanwhile, chaos-affiliated cultists and sorcerers from Terra itself, bare agents of the very forces that the Watchers had been fighting against since before humanity arrived on the planet, had infiltrated the administratum staff that was overseeing Caliban's transformation into an imperial world. These operatives worked to destabilize the planet's governance, to amplify the resentment and confusion that the rapid modernization was already causing, and to create conditions that would make the garrison of Dark Angels left on Caliban vulnerable to corruption. The corruption spread slowly but inexorably. Luther gathered supporters among the Dark Angels who had been left behind, those who shared his sense of abandonment and resentment. Factions formed, tensions escalated, and at the center of it all, buried beneath the planet's surface, the Ouroboros stirred, its power feeding the division and paranoia that was tearing the Legion apart from within. The Watchers in the Dark watched all of this unfold with what we can only imagine was a growing sense of dread. They had been on Caliban for millennia, guarding the Ouroboros, maintaining a careful balance between the forces of corruption and the human civilization that had, through no fault of its own, built its entire existence on top of a warp-tainted prison. They had tried to guide individuals like Zahariel toward opposing the corruption, and they had warned of the evil that lurked beneath the forests. But the speed and scale of what was happening during the heresy was beyond anything that subtle influence could counter. And so, when the power struggle among the fallen angels on Caliban reached its crisis point, the Watchers made a choice. They sided with the Lord Cypher. This is a detail that often gets overlooked in discussions of the fall of Caliban, but it is enormously important for understanding the Watchers' priorities and methods. The Lord Cypher was a specific title within the Dark Angels, originally a position within the order that predated the Legion's founding. The holder of the title was the keeper of secrets and traditions, a guardian of lore and knowledge whose role was to preserve the chapter's deepest mysteries. During the power struggle on Caliban, there were three main factions: Luther's followers, who were being corrupted by chaos; Astellan's faction, composed of Terran-born veterans who had their own grievances and ambitions; and Zahariel's faction, who had fallen under the influence of the Ouroboros and believed it to be the soul of Caliban itself. The Lord Cypher stood apart from all three groups. His agenda was different. He was focused, above all else, on keeping the Ouroboros contained, and on maintaining the prison that the Watchers had built around it over millennia of careful guardianship. In this, his goals aligned perfectly with those of the Watchers, and they chose to support him accordingly. This alliance between the Watchers and Cypher is reflected in an extraordinary scene from the Horus Heresy novel Angels of Caliban by Gav Thorpe. When Zahariel, now fully under the Ouroboros' influence, confronted the Lord Cypher, yet the Watchers in the Dark physically intervened to protect Cypher from Zahariel's psychic attacks. These beings that had never been seen to take direct action in any conflict, that had never raised a hand against any living thing, placed themselves between the corrupted librarian and the man they had chosen to support. Only when Zahariel threatened to unleash the Ouroboros itself did the Watchers back down, recognizing that a direct confrontation risked the very catastrophe they were trying to prevent. The Lord Cypher was eventually killed, likely during the orbital battle over Caliban, though the details remain characteristically obscure. But the title of Cypher survived, passed on to a new bearer whose identity became one of the most enduring mysteries in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. And the Watcher's relationship with whoever holds that title has continued through the millennia, or with the being known as Cypher in the 41st Millennium, displaying a connection to the Watchers that suggests their alliance was never truly broken. When the fall of Caliban finally came, when Lionel Johnson returned from the heresy to find his homeworld in rebellion and was forced to bombard his own planet from orbit, when the Lion and Luther fought their legendary duel in the ruins of the Order's monastery, And when the Chaos Gods tore open the warp in a final act of spite that ripped Caliban apart and scattered the fallen through time and space, the Watchers in the Dark did something that no one expected. They saved the lion. This is one of the most dramatic and emotionally charged moments in the entire Dark Angels saga, and it deserves to be told with the weight it carries. As Luther's sorcerous blast mortally wounded the Primarch, as the planet shattered around them and the warp storm howled through the ruins, the Watchers emerged from wherever they had been concealed and carried the broken body of Lion L. Johnson away. Think about what this means. In the middle of a cataclysm that was literally tearing a planet apart, while reality itself was being ripped open by the spite of gods, these small, silent beings walked through the fire and the falling stone and the screaming madness of a warp rift, and they picked up the broken body of a dying Primarch, a being who weighed hundreds of kilograms in his armor, who was larger than any 3 humans combined, and they carried him to safety. How they accomplished this is never explained. The Watchers are small, barely reaching the waist of an unarmored human. The lion, even mortally wounded, was a being of colossal physical dimensions. The logistics of a group of waist-high robed figures carrying a Primarch through the apocalypse seems impossible, but the Watchers do not operate within the bounds of physical possibility. They exist partially outside the laws that govern the material universe, and if they could appear and disappear at will, if they could perceive time as a navigable dimension rather than an inexorable current, then physical constraints like weight and distance would be obstacles they could simply bypass. Yet they took him deep, deeper than anyone knew it was possible to go, into the very core of what remained of Caliban. And there, in a hidden chamber that would come to exist at the heart of the massive asteroid that the Dark Angels would christen the Rock, the Watchers laid the lion down and began a vigil that would last for 10,000 years. When the surviving Dark Angels descended to the ruins and began searching for their Primarch, they found only Luther, weeping and babbling in the wreckage, at repeating over and over that the lion had been taken by the Watchers in the dark and would return one day to forgive him for his sins. The Dark Angels searched, but they could find no trace of their Gene Father. The Watchers had concealed him so completely, so perfectly, that not even the most thorough investigation could locate his resting place. The lion's wounds healed, his body recovered, but he did not wake. For 10,000 years, as the most powerful Primarch of the Loyalist legions lay in a coma in a chamber known to no one except the Watchers themselves and, it is said, the Emperor. The Dark Angels built their entire chapter, their entire identity, around the secrets of Caliban, around the hunt for the fallen, and the desperate need to conceal the truth of their legion's betrayal. They never knew that the greatest secret of all was not the existence of the fallen or the shame of Luther's rebellion. It was the fact that their father, their Primarch, their lion, was alive and sleeping beneath their feet, watched over by beings whose motives they had never understood and whose nature they could not begin to fathom. Only the Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels was ever told about Luther's imprisonment in the deepest dungeon of the Rock. And even the Supreme Grand Master was not told about the lion. That secret belonged to the Watchers alone. They had taken it upon themselves, yet without asking permission or seeking approval from any human authority, to preserve the Primarch against the day when he would be needed again. It was not a gesture of servitude. It was an investment, a calculation made by beings who could see the flow of time and who had determined that the lion's survival was essential to outcomes that lay centuries or millennia in the future. For 10,000 years after the fall of Caliban, but the Watchers in the Dark inhabited the Rock as its most enigmatic and unsettling residence. To understand what daily life with the Watchers was like for the Dark Angels, you have to imagine sharing your home with beings that you cannot communicate with, cannot understand, and cannot control. Beings that have access to parts of your fortress that you yourself are forbidden from entering, that appear and disappear without warning, that seem to know things they should not possibly know, and that have been explicitly identified by the oldest traditions of your chapter as entities that must never, under any circumstances, be interfered with. Picture it. You are a dark angel. You have been forged into a superhuman warrior through years of genetic modification, surgical enhancement, hypnotic conditioning, and relentless training. You can spit acid. You can survive in hard vacuum. But you have been indoctrinated with 10,000 years of chapter history and the unshakable faith that you are among the Emperor's finest warriors, the sons of the First Legion, inheritors of a legacy that stretches back to the dawn of the Imperium. And then you are walking down a corridor in the depths of the rock, maybe heading to the Reclusium for evening prayers, maybe returning from a training exercise with your squad, and you turn a corner and there is a watcher, standing perfectly still, barely reaching your hip, wrapped in robes that seem to absorb the light around them, its face, if it has a face, lost in the impenetrable shadow of its hood. It does not move. It does not acknowledge your presence. It simply stands there, and you feel, with absolute certainty, that it is aware of you in a way that goes beyond mere sight, that it knows things about you that you do not know about yourself, that it has been standing in this corridor since before you were born and will be standing here long after you are dead. What do? The answer, if you are a faithful son of the First Legion, is nothing. You keep walking. You do not look at it. You do not speak to it. You pretend, with the discipline that has been hammered into you since your first day as a Scout Marine, that it is not there, and you carry on with your duties. It's with the cold knot of unease sitting in your stomach like a stone, and you never, ever mention it to anyone. From their very first days as novitiates, fresh-faced Scout Marines still learning the basics of their new existence as posthuman warriors, all Dark Angels are warned about the Watchers. The warnings are delivered solemnly, seriously, without any of the exaggeration or embellishment that characterizes the kind of stories older soldiers tell to frighten recruits. The Watchers are real, but they are present, and they are not to be touched, questioned, followed, or obstructed in any way. Cautionary tales reinforce these warnings. Whispered stories, passed from scout brother to scout brother in the quiet hours between training exercises and devotional ceremonies, tell of Dark Angels who ignored the warnings. Marines who became too curious, who tried to follow a Watcher to see where it went, who reached out to touch one as it passed, who attempted to peek beneath a hood. These Marines disappeared. They were never seen again. No bodies were found. No explanation was ever given. They simply ceased to exist, as though the Watchers had erased them from reality, as casually as a clerk might strike a name from a ledger. Whether these stories are literally true or merely effective deterrents is impossible to say. What is clear is that the Dark Angels believe them, and their belief shapes every interaction, or rather non-interaction, that they have with the Watchers. The chapter treats the Watchers with a mixture of solemn acceptance and carefully maintained distance. They do not acknowledge the Watchers' presence when they pass them in corridors. They do not speak to them, greet them, or even look directly at them if they can avoid it. The Watchers are treated like a natural feature of the rock's environment, something that simply exists and that one navigates around without comment or curiosity. It's like a wall or a doorway or the hum of the fortress's life support systems. But the Watchers are not passive background elements. They have their own patterns of behavior, their own routines, if such a word can be applied to beings that exist outside of linear time. They are drawn to certain areas of the rock more than others. They haunt the Librarius, the vast archive of scrolls and data slates and ancient texts that contains the chapter's accumulated knowledge. What they do there, what they read or study or search for, is unknown. They are seen in the deep halls where the chapter's most sacred relics are stored, standing before display cases containing weapons and armor that date back to the founding of the Legion. And they are present, always present, in the lowest levels of the rock, in the regions where the fortress gives way to the raw stone of what was once Caliban's crust, or where the air is cold and still, and the walls are marked with symbols that predate human habitation. They also appear on the battlefield. This is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Watcher's behavior, because it seems so completely at odds with their usual pattern of quiet, uninvolved observation. When the Dark Angels go to war, particularly when the highest-ranking members of the chapter take to the field, the Watchers accompany them. They do not fight. They carry no weapons and take no aggressive action against any enemy, but they are there, standing at the sides of the chapter's greatest warriors, bearing ancient relics and sacred artifacts in their small, robed arms. The most famous example of this is the Watcher who accompanies Azrael, the supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels, the chapter's most powerful and most burdened leader. In both the lore and the tabletop miniature, Azrael is depicted with a single Watcher in the dark at his side, carrying the lion helm, one of the chapter's most sacred relics. This Watcher follows Azrael into the most desperate and dangerous of battles, bearing this artifact through the fire and chaos of combat, with an unshakable calm that borders on the otherworldly. And the Watchers are, according to the lore, immune to violence. Attacks pass through them or around them without effect, bolter rounds, las beams. On the psychic assaults of chaos sorcerers, none of these can harm a Watcher in the dark. This immunity is not a product of armor or shields or any conventional form of protection. It appears to be a fundamental property of their existence, a consequence of being composed of something that physical force simply cannot interact with. They are present in the material universe. They can be seen and perceived, but they cannot be harmed by it. They exist here, but they are not truly of here. This immunity extends to the warp as well. The psychic powers that can shatter minds and corrupt souls and tear holes in the fabric of reality have no effect on the Watchers. They cannot be possessed, corrupted, or influenced by chaos in any form. This is not merely a resistance or a high degree of tolerance. It is absolute immunity, a total separation from the mechanisms through which the warp exerts its influence on the material universe. And this, perhaps more than anything else, that is what makes the Watchers invaluable to the Dark Angels. In a galaxy where chaos is an ever-present threat, where even the most devout and disciplined warrior can be corrupted, given enough time and enough pressure, the Watchers represent something that is completely beyond the reach of the ruinous powers. Any Dark Angel who gains the honor of being accompanied by a Watcher into battle is said to be destined for great things. This is not merely a superstitious belief or a motivational tradition. It is an observed pattern, borne out by centuries of chapter history. Warriors who are accompanied by Watchers tend to survive battles that should have killed them, to make tactical decisions that prove inspired, to achieve outcomes that defy the odds. Whether the Watchers are actively influencing events in these cases, are subtly guiding the warriors they accompany toward better outcomes through means that are imperceptible to human senses, or whether they simply choose to accompany individuals whose futures they have already perceived as significant, is impossible to determine. But the effect is real, and the Dark Angels recognize it as such. The Watchers also maintain custody of Luther, the arch-traitor, who was imprisoned in the deepest dungeon of the rock after the fall of Caliban. For 10,000 years, Luther sat in chains in a cell that no one except the Supreme Grand Master was permitted to enter, raving and weeping, and occasionally delivering cryptic prophecies about the return of the lion and the redemption of the fallen. The Watchers guarded this cell, ensuring that Luther could not escape and that the Dark Angel's darkest secret remained hidden from all but the highest levels of the inner circle. And then there is their relationship with Cypher, then that most enigmatic and frustrating of all the fallen angels. Whenever Cypher was captured and brought to the rock, which happened multiple times over the course of 10,000 years, the Watchers' behavior would change. They would become more active, more visible, moving through the corridors of the fortress in greater numbers, and with a sense of purpose that they did not normally display, and somehow, without anyone ever witnessing the act, Cypher would escape every single time. As the inner circle of the Dark Angels eventually came to suspect that Cypher was under the protection of some higher power, and the behavior of the Watchers during his visits to the rock only strengthened this suspicion. What they could not determine was why. Why would the Watchers, these ancient and inscrutable beings, protect a fallen angel? What purpose did Cypher serve in whatever grand design the Watchers were pursuing? And what did Cypher know about them that no one else did? But the shocking truth, revealed in Gav Thorpe's Legacy of Caliban novels, was that Cypher had not merely escaped from the Rock multiple times. He had been released. Each Supreme Grandmaster, upon meeting with Cypher and hearing whatever he had to say, had made the decision to let him go. And the Watchers had supported this decision every time, their behavior serving as a kind of silent endorsement that the inner circle had learned to read, even if they could not fully understand. And one of the most peculiar and telling aspects of the Watchers' relationship with the Dark Angels is the way they have interacted with Tukulcha, the sentient warp engine that was kept secretly aboard the Rock for millennia. Tukulcha was, like the Ouroboros and the Plague Heart, a creation of the Old Ones, a piece of ancient technology that possessed a form of consciousness and the ability to navigate the warp with precision that no other device in the Imperium could match. As during the Horus Heresy, the Lion had acquired Tukulcha and used it to guide his fleet when the Astronomicon went dark, allowing the Dark Angels to navigate the warp without the guiding beacon that every other Imperial fleet depended on. The connection between Tukulcha and the Watchers is not explicitly detailed in the lore, but the implications are powerful. Both are connected to the Old Ones. Both have associations with Caliban. And Tukulcha itself referred to Caliban as its home and spoke of salvation waiting there, not just for itself, but for the Dark Angels as well. If the Watchers were originally sent to Caliban to guard the Ouroboros, and if all three devices, Ouroboros, Tukulcha, and Plagueheart, were parts of a single Old Ones construct, then the Watchers' guardianship extended by implication to all three pieces of the key, even if they could only directly watch over the one that was physically present on Caliban. This broader guardianship helps explain why the Watchers remained on the Rock even after Caliban was destroyed, and the Ouroboros was no longer directly within their immediate reach. The Rock still contained Tukulcha, hidden away in chambers that the chapter's own leadership might not have been fully aware of. The Watchers still had something to guard, something to watch over, but something that connected them to the ancient purpose that had brought them to this corner of the galaxy in the first place. And when Cypher turned himself into the inner circle in the 41st Millennium and revealed the existence of Tukulcha to the Dark Angels' leadership, the Watchers' reaction served as the crucial deciding factor. It was the Watchers' support of Cypher's mission, their silent but unmistakable endorsement of his plan to bring the three devices together over the ruins of Caliban and then destroy the resulting time portal that convinced Azrael and the inner circle to cooperate with a fallen angel. Without the Watchers' backing, the Dark Angels would never have agreed. With it, they felt confident enough to take one of the most dangerous risks in the chapter's history. The result was the opening of a time rift over the ruins of Caliban, as a portal that could theoretically have been used to travel back to the moment of Caliban's destruction and alter the course of history. The temptation must have been almost unbearable for the Dark Angels. Here was a chance to undo their greatest shame, to prevent the fallen from ever existing, to save their homeworld and preserve their honor. But Ezekiel, the chapter's chief librarian, counseled Azrael that the fall of the lion was meant to be, that altering history was too dangerous. And Azrael destroyed the time portal, creating in the process the very same warp storm that had originally scattered the fallen across time and space 10,000 years earlier. This is what is known as a causal loop, a temporal paradox in which the cause of an event is also its consequence. The warp storm that created the fallen was itself created by the destruction of the time portal that the fallen's existence made necessary. Effect became cause. The circle closed. And the Watchers, who could perceive time as a three-dimensional structure rather than a linear progression, may have known this all along. They may have been working toward this exact outcome for 10,000 years, guiding events with infinite patience toward a moment that was simultaneously the beginning and the end of the Dark Angels' great shame. The Watchers' plan to save the galaxy, as revealed in the lore, was to engineer the destruction of Caliban, creating the only outcome they believed could work. They had examined the potential futures in their mosaic of time and determined that the survival of Caliban was the worst-case scenario. Whatever the planet contained, whatever the Ouroboros and the rest of the key could do if left intact and accessible, the Watchers had concluded that it was better for the planet to be destroyed, even if the method of that destruction involved tremendous suffering and the creation of a wound that would haunt the First Legion for millennia. Yes, this is the scale at which the Watchers operate. They are willing to sacrifice an entire world to allow a beloved Primarch to be mortally wounded, to condemn thousands of Space Marines to lives of guilt and secrecy, and the endless hunt for their own fallen brothers, all in service of an outcome that they believe is necessary for the survival of the galaxy. It is a ruthlessness that goes beyond anything human, but beyond even the cold calculus that the Imperium of man routinely employs in its prosecution of the Emperor's wars. But it is a ruthlessness born not of malice or indifference, but of a perspective that encompasses timescales and consequences that no human mind could fully grasp. And then the lion woke up. After 10,000 years of slumber, after an age of darkness in which the Imperium fractured and decayed, and the enemies of humanity multiplied beyond counting, our Lionel Johnson finally opened his eyes, and it was the Watchers who were there to greet him. The Lion's awakening is one of the most significant events in the current era of Warhammer 40,000, the era Indomitus, and the Watchers played a central role in every aspect of it. According to the novel The Lion, Son of the Forest by Mike Brooks and the Arcs of Omen campaign books, the Lion awoke not in the physical chamber where his body had lain for millennia, but in a mysterious realm known as Mirror Caliban, a place that existed between the material universe and the warp, a kind of extra-dimensional echo of the world that had been destroyed 10,000 years before. Imagine what that must have been like. For 10,000 years, there had been nothing. No dreams, no sensation, no passage of time, just an absolute void of unconsciousness. A darkness so complete that when awareness finally returned, the mind struggled to believe that it had ever existed at all. And then, gradually, sensation. The feeling of ground beneath his feet, the smell of earth and leaves and something clean and green and alive, the sound of wind moving through branches, of water running over stones, of birdsong that should have been impossible on a planet that no longer existed. Mirror Caliban was a forest. Of course it was. The Lion had been born in the forests of Caliban. Cain had spent his earliest years surviving alone in their warp-haunted depths, had grown to become the greatest hunter and warrior that world had ever known. And now, at the moment of his return, he found himself in a forest again, disoriented and without his memories, alone in a place that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The trees of Mirror Caliban were tall and ancient, but unlike the twisted, warp-corrupted trees of the Caliban the Lion remembered, these were straight and strong, their canopies filtering sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. There was a peace to this place that had never existed in the real Caliban, a serenity that spoke of a world as it might have been if the corruption had never taken hold, if the Ouroboros had never leaked its poison into the soil and the water and the living things. The forest of Mirror Caliban was not a physical place in the conventional sense. It was something between dimensions, as a layer of reality that existed in the spaces between the warp and the materium. The Lion could use it to travel enormous distances, stepping from one planet to another by walking through the trees, as though the forest connected every world in the galaxy through pathways that only he could traverse. This ability, which became known as forest walking, was intimately connected to both the nature of Caliban as an Old One's artifact and the influence of the Watchers who had watched over the Lion during his long sleep. When the Lion first encountered a Watcher in Mirror Caliban, he asked where they were. The Watcher's response was simple and characteristic: home. That single word, perhaps the first that the Lion heard upon returning to consciousness after 10 millennia, carried a weight of meaning that went far beyond geography. For the Watchers, Caliban or whatever remained of its essence in this extra-dimensional space, was home. It was the place they had been sent to guard, the world around which their entire purpose had been organized. And even though the physical planet had been destroyed, its spirit, or at least some form of its existence, endured in this place between worlds. The Watcher warned the lion about the old king, a figure who sat by a river in Mirror Caliban and who was almost certainly a manifestation of the Emperor. She, wounded and diminished, but still present, still watching over the galaxy from whatever remained of his consciousness on the Golden Throne. The Watcher told the lion to beware of the shadows that dwelt near the king. And when the lion discovered a domed building within the forest, the Watcher warned him against entering it, saying he was not yet strong enough to do so safely. When the frustrated Primarch demanded to know what he should be doing, the Watcher gave him perhaps the most characteristically cryptic piece of advice in the entire history of Warhammer 40,000. Follow your nature. And the lion, being the lion, interpreted this as a command to hunt, to find enemies and destroy them, to protect the weak and punish the guilty, to be the warrior that the Emperor had created him to be, in a galaxy that needed warriors more desperately than ever before. The Watchers guided the lion out of Mirror Caliban and into the Imperium Nihilus, or the dark half of the galaxy that had been cut off from the light of the Astronomicon by the Great Rift, that vast warp storm that now bisected the entire Imperium. Here, isolated from the guidance of the Emperor and the authority of the Imperium's central government, countless human worlds were fighting desperate, lonely wars against enemies that seemed to multiply with every passing day. The lion threw himself into these wars with a ferocity and determination that reminded everyone who witnessed it why the Dark Angels had been called the Emperor's wrath made manifest. He gathered fallen angels to his side, not to punish them, but to offer them redemption. Those who had been scattered through time by the warp storm, who had spent centuries or millennia wandering the galaxy as fugitives from their own chapter, but were given the chance to swear their loyalty to the lion once more and fight in his name against the enemies of humanity. Some refused and were dealt with accordingly, but many accepted, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the lion commanded a force that included both loyal Dark Angels and redeemed fallen, fighting side by side as brothers should. And throughout all of this, the Watchers were present. They accompanied the lion on his campaigns. They appeared at crucial moments, offering guidance through their characteristic silence and their uncanny ability to be exactly where they needed to be at exactly the right time. They were the lion's connection to Mirror Caliban, to the forest that served as his highway between worlds. And through that connection, they continued to influence events with the same subtle, patient, infinitely patient manipulation that had defined their approach for millennia beyond counting. The culmination of the lion's return, yes, at least in the current narrative, came during the Arcs of Omen campaign, when Commander Dante of the Blood Angels tracked down the lion and brought him to confront the forces of chaos at the Somnium Stars. There, the Dark Angels discovered that Vashtor the Arcaphani had used his techno-sorcery to reassemble the shattered fragments of Caliban into a nightmarish demon world called Wormwood, a twisted mockery of the Dark Angels' lost homeworld that served as the chassis for the reassembled key. The lion fought Angron, the demon Primarch of Khorne, in single combat on the surface of this reborn and corrupted Caliban. It was a clash of titans, a duel between two Primarchs that shook the very ground beneath their feet and echoed through the warp with the force of a psychic earthquake. The lion won, banishing Angron back to the Immaterium with a combination of superior swordsmanship and the sheer force of will that had made him one of the most formidable warriors the Emperor had ever created. But the victory was incomplete. Vashtor succeeded in stealing the two-culture engine from the rock during the battle, completing the key and activating the dissonance engine that allowed the corrupted Caliban to bore through the webway like a planet-sized drill. Abaddon, Vashtor, and Wormwood vanished into the breach, leaving the Loyalist forces victorious on the battlefield, but facing the terrifying knowledge that the forces of chaos now possessed a weapon of Old One's origin that could potentially reach sealed vaults containing artifacts from the war in heaven. For the Watchers, this outcome represented both a triumph and a catastrophe. The lion had returned. The Primarch they had preserved for 10,000 years was once again active and fighting for humanity. But the key they had guarded, the artifact they had been sent to Caliban to contain, was now in the hands of the enemy. The balance of their ancient vigil had shifted, and the consequences of that shift would ripple through the galaxy for years, perhaps centuries, to come. So where does all of this leave us? After all these millennia of lore, all these novels and codex entries and fragments of whispered history, what do we actually know about the Watchers in the dark? And what remains hidden in the shadows beneath their hoods? Let us lay out what can be said with reasonable confidence, drawing on the accumulated evidence of decades of Warhammer 40,000 storytelling. First, the Watchers are extra-dimensional beings. They are not from the material universe, and they are not from the warp. They originate from a higher dimension, a realm that operates under fundamentally different rules than either of the two dimensions that define the cosmology of the setting. But in their native state, concepts like time and space are not constraints, but landscapes, things that can be traversed and examined and manipulated with a freedom that no being bound to the material universe can match. Second, the Watchers were sent to Caliban, or perhaps chose to go there in order to guard the Ouroboros, 1/3 of a device created by the Old Ones that could be used to build and expand the webway. They were the Ouroboros' jailers, as maintaining a vigil over the artifact that lasted for millennia before humanity even arrived on the planet. Their guardianship extended, by implication, to the protection of the galaxy from the consequences of the key being assembled and misused. Third, the Watchers are associated with the Cabal, the multi-species organization dedicated to fighting chaos, but they held a fundamentally different philosophical position than the Cabal's mainstream. Where the Cabal believed chaos could be permanently destroyed through the right combination of galactic-scale events, the Watchers believed that chaos could not be defeated and could only be fought. This belief shaped their approach to everything, making them perpetual guardians rather than would-be conquerors. Fourth, the Watchers possess abilities that place them in a category of power that very few entities in the Warhammer 40,000 universe can match. Then they can perceive time as a multidimensional structure. They can appear and disappear at will. They are immune to physical violence and psychic attack. They cannot be corrupted by chaos. They can communicate psychically when they choose to, though they almost never exercise this ability. And their physical form in the material universe is merely an approximation, a shape they adopt for convenience rather than their true nature. Fifth, the Watchers guided and influenced the Dark Angels across the entire span of the chapter's history, from the earliest days of human civilization on Caliban through the Horus Heresy, the fall of Caliban, and the 10,000-year vigil that followed. They preserved the Lion, guarded Luther, supported Cypher, and accompanied the chapter's greatest warriors into battle, all while maintaining an absolute silence about their own nature, origins, and ultimate goals. And sixth, and perhaps most importantly, the Watchers remain fundamentally unknowable. Despite everything we have just discussed, we still do not know what they actually look like beneath their robes. We do not know the name of their home dimension, or the nature of their society, if they even have one. We do not know who sent them to Caliban, or what authority, if any, they answer to. We do not know whether they have a specific end goal that they are working toward, or whether they are committed to an eternal vigil with no defined conclusion. We do not know how many of them exist, whether they can die, what they experience when they are not manifesting in the material universe, or what they truly think of the Space Marines who live alongside them. And honestly, that is perfect. The Watchers in the Dark are a masterpiece of science fiction world-building precisely because of what we do not know about them. In a setting that has been explored through hundreds of novels, thousands of codex entries, and decades of community discussion, the Watchers remain genuinely, thrillingly mysterious. They are a reminder that the Warhammer 40,000 universe is bigger than any one perspective can encompass. That there are forces at work in the galaxy that operate on timescales and at levels of power that dwarf even the mightiest empires and the most powerful gods. They remind us that not everything can be explained, that some mysteries are better left unsolved, that the darkness at the edge of the campfire's light is not empty but full of things that watch us with eyes we cannot see, that know us better than we know ourselves. That have been waiting since before we were born, and will continue waiting long after we are gone. Let me take you through some of the most prominent theories that fans and lore enthusiasts have proposed over the years about the true nature of the Watchers in the Dark. Each one has merit, each one has evidence to support it, and each one ultimately falls short of a complete explanation. That is the nature of a good mystery. The first theory, and perhaps the most popular, is that the Watchers are the Old Ones themselves, or more precisely, the remnants of that ancient race reduced and diminished from their former glory, but still carrying out the duties that were assigned to them during the war in heaven. The Old Ones were the dominant species in the galaxy millions of years before the rise of humanity. They were master psychers, creators of the webway, shapers of species, manipulators of the very fabric of reality. They created the Eldari, the Krork who became the Orcs, and countless other species to serve as soldiers and servants in their war against the Necrontyr and the Satan. When the war in heaven ended, the Old Ones disappeared. Some accounts suggest they were destroyed. Others imply they simply withdrew, retreating to dimensions beyond the reach of their enemies. If the Watchers are diminished Old Ones, their extra-dimensional nature, their connection to the artifacts of the Old Ones like the Ouroboros and Tushulcha, and their abilities to perceive time as a spatial phenomenon would all make sense. The Old Ones were beings of such power that even in a reduced state, they might possess capabilities that seem godlike to lesser species. And the concept of an ancient, once mighty race, reduced to silent guardianship, watching over the remnants of their civilization's greatest achievements, has a tragic grandeur to it that fits perfectly with the tone of Warhammer 40,000. The second theory proposes that the Watchers are not the Old Ones themselves, but a species created by the Old Ones, purpose-built guardians designed specifically to watch over the artifacts and constructs that their creators left behind. Just as the Old Ones created the Eldari for war and the Krork for brute force, perhaps they also created a species designed for patience and observation, beings whose very nature was oriented toward guardianship and the long vigil. This theory explains why the Watchers seem so singularly focused on their task, and why they appear to lack the broader ambitions or agendas that one might expect from a truly independent species. The third theory is more speculative, but equally fascinating. It suggests that the Watchers are beings from a dimension that predates both the material universe and the warp, entities that existed before the current cosmological order was established and that were somehow caught up in or chose to involve themselves in the affairs of the younger dimensions. This would make them truly alien in the deepest sense of the word, beings whose origins and nature are fundamentally outside the framework that everything else in Warhammer 40,000 operates within. A fourth theory, more recently proposed in light of the revelations about Caliban being an Old One's construct, and suggests that the Watchers might be a manifestation of Caliban itself, a kind of immune system or maintenance crew for the planetary artifact, beings generated by the construct to protect its integrity and prevent its power from being misused. This would explain their intense connection to the planet and their continued presence on the rock, which is literally a fragment of the original Caliban. If the planet was a machine, the Watchers might be its operators, and still carrying out their programming, even though the machine itself has been destroyed. There is even a deeply philosophical theory that the Watchers are a corporeal manifestation of the Unforgiven's collective guilt, that the shame and secrecy that the Dark Angels carry like a weight across their souls has somehow taken physical form, given substance by the psychic energy of 10,000 years of obsessive penitence. This theory is almost certainly wrong in any literal sense, but it captures something true about the emotional resonance of the Watchers within the Dark Angel's story. They are, in a very real narrative sense, the physical embodiment of everything the Dark Angels cannot say, cannot explain, cannot confess. They are the silence at the heart of the Legion's great lie, given form and substance, and set loose to wander the corridors of the rock, like living reminders that the truth is always watching, even when it chooses not to speak. Each of these theories illuminates a different aspect of what makes the Watchers so compelling, and the fact that none of them can be definitively confirmed or denied is a testament to Games Workshop's restraint in handling one of their setting's most delicate and valuable mysteries. But beyond the theories, beyond the speculation and the debate, there is something more fundamental about the Watchers that I think gets lost sometimes in the rush to categorize and explain them. And that is the sheer emotional power of their presence in the story. Think about what it means for the Dark Angels to share their home with beings they cannot understand. Think about what it does to a chapter that is already defined by secrecy and guilt, and the constant fear of exposure to know that there are entities living among them that possess knowledge far beyond anything the chapter's own leadership can access. The Watchers know where the lion sleeps. They knew about the Ouroboros. They know what lies in the sealed chambers of the rock that no Dark Angel has ever entered. They carry the chapter's most sacred relics into battle. They stand beside the Supreme Grand Master in his moments of greatest crisis. And they never explain any of it. For a chapter that is obsessed with controlling information, with maintaining the integrity of its secrets, with ensuring that the truth about the fallen never reaches the ears of the wider Imperium, is the presence of beings that know more than anyone and answer to no authority must be absolutely maddening. The Dark Angels cannot interrogate the Watchers. They cannot extract confessions from them. They cannot torture them for information or threaten them with consequences. The Watchers are beyond all of the tools that the interrogator chaplains use to break the will of captured fallen. They are, in a sense, the one secret that the Dark Angels can never unlock, as the one mystery that their legendary paranoia and obsessive information control cannot penetrate. And yet they accept the Watchers. They do not try to destroy them or expel them from the rock. They acknowledge them, however silently, as part of their existence. This acceptance, this willingness to coexist with the unknowable, is perhaps the most human thing about the Dark Angels. It suggests that, beneath all the armor and the genetically engineered posthuman capabilities and the 10,000-year-old traditions of war and secrecy, there is still something in them that recognizes humility. Something that understands, even if it will never admit it out loud, that there are things in the universe that are bigger and older and wiser than even the First Legion, and that the appropriate response to those things is not defiance or conquest, but quiet, watchful respect. All of these theories have some support in the lore, and none of them can be definitively confirmed or denied. That is the beauty of a well-maintained mystery. It invites speculation without rewarding certainty. It keeps the imagination engaged without ever allowing it to settle into complacency. There is a broader point worth making here about why the Watchers matter, not just to the Dark Angel's story, but to the Warhammer 40,000 setting as a whole. And in a universe that is fundamentally defined by conflict, where every faction is locked in a perpetual struggle for survival against enemies both external and internal, the Watchers represent something that is genuinely unique, a force that operates entirely outside the conventional dynamics of war. Every other faction in Warhammer 40,000 can be understood through the lens of warfare. The Space Marines are warriors, the Imperial Guard are soldiers, or the Orcs live for combat and exist in a state of perpetual warlike frenzy. The Tyranids are a biological war machine consuming the galaxy one world at a time. The Aeldari fight to prevent the extinction of their species. The Necrons wage wars of reconquest to reclaim their ancient empire. Even the Chaos Gods, for all their cosmic horror and metaphysical complexity, can ultimately be understood as entities that wage war on reality itself. But the Watchers do not wage war. Whilst they do not conquer or defend territory, they do not field armies or fleets or weapons of mass destruction. They do not even fight on an individual level. Their resistance to chaos is not active opposition, but passive immunity. a fundamental incompatibility with the forces of corruption that renders them invisible to the predatory gaze of the warp. They are, in a setting defined by violent conflict, beings of profound and deliberate peace. And yet, they are more effective in their fight against chaos than most of the galaxy's actual armies. By preserving the lion, by guarding the Ouroboros, by guiding events through subtle manipulation rather than direct force, the Watchers have influenced the course of galactic history in ways that entire crusades and campaigns could not match. They preserved a Primarch for 10,000 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to restore him to the galaxy. But they engineered the destruction of a planet to prevent a cosmic-level catastrophe. They maintained a vigil over an artifact of world-ending power across a span of time that makes the entire history of the Imperium look brief. This is a profoundly different model of opposing evil than anything else in the setting offers, and it raises questions that I think are deeply relevant to the themes that Warhammer 40,000 explores. Can evil be fought without violence? Or is patience a more effective weapon than fury? Can beings who refuse to kill or harm still make a difference in a universe where killing and harm are the primary currencies of power? The Watchers suggest that the answer to all of these questions is yes. And in doing so, they challenge the fundamental assumptions of the setting itself. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Watchers in the dark offer an alternative. Not peace exactly, not harmony or coexistence, or any of the other utopian concepts that the 41st millennium has ground to dust, but something quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. The simple, stubborn refusal to participate in the cycle of violence, combined with the wisdom and patience to make that refusal meaningful. They are the Watchers, not the fighters, and in a galaxy that has fought itself nearly to extinction over the course of 10,000 years. That distinction may be the most important thing about them. There is also the matter of how the Watchers relate to the Dark Angels on a symbolic and thematic level that goes beyond the plot mechanics of who they are and what they do. The Dark Angels are, above all else, a chapter defined by secrets. Their entire identity, their culture, their rituals, their organization, everything about the way they exist is shaped by the need to conceal the truth of the fallen from the wider Imperium. This obsessive secrecy has twisted the chapter in ways that their founding Primarch probably never intended, creating a culture of paranoia and deception that extends from the lowest-ranking Scout Marine to the Supreme Grand Master himself. The Watchers are the ultimate expression of this theme. They are secrets incarnate, mysteries given physical form. They know things that no one else knows. They go places that no one else can go. They cannot be interrogated, scanned, or deciphered by any means available to the Imperium's most advanced technology or the chapter's most gifted psychers. In a chapter obsessed with controlling information, the Watchers represent the absolute limit of that control, the point beyond which even the Dark Angels' legendary paranoia cannot penetrate. And the fact that the Dark Angels accept this, that they live alongside beings whose secrets they can never uncover and whose motives they can never fully understand, says something profound about the nature of secrecy itself. Some secrets are so big, so old, so fundamentally beyond the capacity of human or post-human understanding that the only appropriate response is acceptance. Not understanding, not control, just acceptance. And the humility that comes with recognizing that there are forces in the universe that were old when humanity was young and that will continue their work long after the last human has drawn their final breath. And on the tabletop itself, the Watchers appear as small companion figures, accompanying certain Dark Angels characters, most notably Supreme Grandmaster Azrael and Lionel Johnson himself. The Lion's model comes with two Watchers, tiny robed figures that add an unmistakable air of mystery and gravity to an already imposing miniature. Even in the context of a war game, where the primary concern is usually statistics and tactical viability, the Watchers manage to communicate something of their lore-rich significance. They are visual shorthand for everything that makes the Dark Angels unique. The secrecy, the ancient connections, the burden of knowledge that no other chapter carries. The Lion's tabletop ability, called No Hiding from the Watchers, provides a protective aura against mortal wounds for nearby friendly units, which is a beautifully elegant translation of their lore into game mechanics. Their passive, a protective presence on the battlefield, their ability to shield those they accompany from harm without taking direct action themselves, mirrors perfectly the way they function in the narrative. They do not fight, they do not attack, they simply exist, and their existence makes those around them harder to harm. It is also worth considering what the Watchers tell us about the nature of chaos itself, and about the broader cosmological structure of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Thus, the existence of beings who are completely immune to the warp suggests that the warp's influence, while vast and terrible, is not truly universal. There are dimensions, planes of existence, forms of being that the Chaos Gods cannot touch. The Watchers are living proof that the galaxy contains things that exist entirely outside the jurisdiction of the ruinous powers, and that these things are older and, in some ways, more powerful than the gods of chaos themselves. This is a comforting thought, almost if comfort is a word that can be applied to anything in the 41st millennium. The Chaos Gods are often portrayed as omnipotent within their domain, as forces so vast and so primal that resistance is ultimately futile. But the Watchers demonstrate that this portrayal is incomplete. There are limits to what chaos can reach. There are entities that the Dark Gods cannot corrupt, cannot consume, cannot even perceive. And these entities are still active, still working against chaos in their quiet, but patient, infinitely subtle way. The Watchers have been watching for longer than the Chaos Gods have been worshipped. They were fighting this war before the fall of the Eldari, before the birth of Slaanesh, before the Eye of Terror tore open the galaxy. They will still be fighting it when the current age has passed into memory and new ages have risen and fallen in their turn. They are, in the most literal sense, eternal guardians, and their eternity encompasses and outlasts even the seemingly boundless duration of chaos itself. But there is one thing that all the theories agree on, one truth that emerges clearly from every piece of evidence we have examined tonight. The Watchers in the dark are not mere servants or curiosities or background decoration. They are agents of a purpose so vast and so old that it makes the 10,000-year history of the Imperium of man look like a footnote. They have been fighting the war against chaos since before humanity knew that such a war existed, and they will continue fighting it long after the last bolt shell has been fired and the last chainsword has fallen silent. They do not seek glory or recognition. They do not want worship or gratitude. They do not ask for thanks or acknowledgement. They simply watch and wait. And when the moment comes, when the balance tips and the darkness threatens to overwhelm the light, they act quietly, subtly, with a precision that only beings who can see the shape of time itself could achieve. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the Watchers in the dark offer something that is perhaps more valuable than any weapon or any army. They offer perspective, a reminder that there are forces in the galaxy that predate the Imperium, predate the Chaos Gods, predate the very concept of war, and that these forces have not given up, that somewhere in the shadows beneath the cowl, behind the silence and the mystery and the impenetrable patience, something is watching over us. Something that believes, with a certainty born of eons of observation, that the fight is worth fighting, even if it can never be won. And in a universe as dark as this one, that might just be the closest thing to hope that anyone is ever going to get. Thank you all so much for listening tonight. If you made it this far, I want you to know that I genuinely appreciate you spending your time here with me. This channel exists because of people like you, and every view, every subscription, every notification bell that gets clicked tells me that there are others out there who find the same comfort and fascination in these stories that I do. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of the Watchers in the Dark, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. Yet it helps the algorithm show these videos to other people who might enjoy them, and it lets me keep creating content like this for you. Share it with a friend who loves Warhammer lore, or drop a comment telling me which mystery of the 41st Millennium you would like me to explore next. I read every single comment, and your suggestions have led to some of my favorite scripts. Until next time, take care of yourselves, rest easy, and remember, in the darkness between the stars, as something is watching, something ancient, something patient, something that has been there since before the beginning, and will be there long after the end, and it knows your name. There is, I think, one final detail worth mentioning before we part ways tonight. A small thing, perhaps, but one that adds an unexpected layer of resonance to everything we have discussed. The name itself, the Watchers in the Dark. It is not a random designation. What the lore suggests that the name is derived from a very real mythological and religious tradition, one that stretches back to the oldest texts of human civilization. In the Jewish and Christian apocryphal traditions, the Watchers, known in Hebrew as the Irin, were a class of angels mentioned in the book of Daniel and more extensively in the book of Enoch. These Watchers were sent by God to observe humanity and to watch over the earth. Some remained faithful to their purpose, standing as silent sentinels over the affairs of mortals. Others fell, tempted by the beauty of human women, and became the fallen angels of Judeo-Christian mythology, beings who abandoned their ordained duty and were cast down from heaven as punishment. The parallels to the Dark Angels story are so obvious that they can hardly be accidental. The Dark Angels are the first legion. Their great tragedy is the fall, the moment when part of their brotherhood was corrupted and turned against those who remained loyal. The fallen angels of the Dark Angels story mirror the fallen Watchers of the apocryphal tradition, beings who were created for a higher purpose, but who succumbed to weakness and ambition, and were punished with exile and damnation. And the Watchers in the dark, the small, silent, robed figures who stand as guardians and observers in the deepest parts of the rock, as correspond to the faithful Watchers, the angels who did not fall, who remained true to their purpose even as their brothers were cast down into darkness. They are the ones who stayed, the ones who kept watch, the ones who chose duty over temptation and patience over glory, and who continue to serve silently and without recognition in a universe that has long since forgotten what it means to be truly faithful. While this biblical resonance gives the Watchers in the dark a depth of meaning that goes beyond their function within the plot. They are not just mysterious aliens or convenient narrative devices. They are an archetype, a symbol drawn from the deepest wells of human storytelling, representing the idea that there are forces in the universe that watch over us without our knowledge, that guard against dangers we cannot perceive, and that ask for nothing in return. Yet in a setting as relentlessly dark and cynical as Warhammer 40,000, where every act of heroism is tainted by fanaticism and every victory is bought with suffering, the Watchers represent something remarkably pure. They are beings who serve without expectation of reward, who protect without seeking recognition, who endure without complaint across timescales that reduce human empires to footnotes. They are, in the truest sense of the word, faithful. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where faith is more often a weapon than a comfort, that quiet, unassuming faithfulness might be the most radical and subversive thing of all. Good night.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.